Chapter 4. Opening. One page taken from the Death Note, or even a fragment of a page, contains the full effect of the Death Note. The atmosphere in the lunar audience chamber was different than it had been before. Fewer ponies filled the auditorium than last night, but what they lacked in numbers, they'd more than made up for in noise. Instead of breaking into groups based on race, this time the ponies had split into two camps of about equal size, divided down the very center of the room. Princess Luna listened closely to both groups from the shadows in the rafters. From what she could gather, the ponies on the right side supported L, while those on the left were dead set against working with him. This worried her. She'd learned in the past what discord could do to a group. If this arguing persisted, all the progress they'd made would be undone. Fewer ponies paid attention as the Lunar Princess fluttered down onto the stage. Sideline had already set up L's tripodal voice box and was standing by the projector, ready with several slides laid out before her. "The Night Court is now in session," Luna bellowed, which lowered most of the voices in the hall to a murmur. "L, are you with us?"
"I am here, Luna,"
the cracked voice boomed. "Great. Under the circumstances, I'd like to open the floor right away to any pony who wishes to speak." Luna groaned inwardly as Captain Strawbolt rose to his feet. He appeared to have nominated himself spokespony of the anti-L movement, no doubt simply due to his large size and stature. His wings shot out with a loud metallic screech, silencing ponies behind him.
"L," he barked at the tiny box, "you have a lot of explaining to do."
"Yes, indeed. You are no doubt wondering how I had divined that Kira was in Pennyville. Sideline, slide 1.
Before the guard captain could object, a long list of names and numbers appeared on the back wall.
I'm trying to figure out how Kira operates. I also went over the question of where he gets his information. Only major sensational crimes are reported on Crystal Vision, and any public police records are only updated once necessary paperwork has been completed. For up-to-date information on recent events and criminals currently at large, Kira would have to turn to an entirely different medium. Slide 2.
A new table appeared, showing the names of publications and several columns of times and dates.
I singled out 2 major newspapers, Equestria Daily and the Trotter, as the most likely sources for Kira's information. Both originate from the printing house of Pretty Press and Textile here in Canterbury. I compared the delivery schedules of these papers to the times of death of any criminals they reported on. All the larger cities like Canterbury and Manhattan regularly have early releases and special editions. Relatively smaller towns like Prettyville get their news on a more regular basis, and not at all on Sundays. No matter what the type or severity of the crime, no criminal reported in these publications was killed until shortly after the respective newspaper had arrived in Prettyville. This is by no means conclusive evidence, but it was enough to point me in the right direction.
Strawbolt ground his teeth.
"Clever," he remarked dryly, "but I was referring to that stunt you pulled a few hours ago on that broadcast, where you had a pony killed right in front of the princess."
Ah, yes, that.
L coughed, the distortion making his voice sound like a scrape of metal on metal. Several ponies flinched.
I'm not going to pretend that what I did was acceptable. I'm sure that once this is over, I will be on the receiving end of an official reprimand.
"Was Celestia aware of this plan? I highly doubt she would have approved."
Another cough.
No, Lady Celestia believed that Caramel was me, and treated him accordingly. Had she thought otherwise, she would not have introduced him as L, and our broadcast would have lost credibility. Lady Luna, have you yet apologized to her for me?
Luna hung her head. "No, El, I haven't seen her. She's locked herself in her bedroom."
A pity. I hope that you will speak to her as soon as possible.
Luna nodded.
In the meantime, I think that it's best that we focus on the nobility of Caramel's sacrifice and the valuable information he brought us.
Captain Strawbolt was undeterred.
"A sacrifice you orchestrated."
"Captain Strawbolt!" Luna stomped a hoof angrily, sending a rumble of thunder around the room. "I personally approved L's plan before it was put into action. He has not only proven the existence of Kira, but given us a location, while your infighting has accomplished nothing. You will sit down
and we'll not speak of this incident again."
The captain tried to stare the pair down, but he found himself powerless under the gaze of the Lunar Princess. Grumbling, he fluttered his wings angrily and folded his legs beneath him.
"Thank you."
Elle's voice box said in a softer tone, just loud enough for Luna to hear. She allowed herself a small smile.
"Now,
He continued in his normal voice.
we need to look to the future if we are to get any closer to Kira. He knows that we are looking for him, so we must act quickly before he can take countermeasures against us. Firstly, we must look more closely into how Kira kills, and find ways to prevent it. To that end, I have prepared this, slide 3.
The pictures of 6 ponies appeared on the screen behind Elle.
These ponies are scheduled to appear in either of the 2 aforementioned newspapers later today. 2 murderers, 3 thieves, and an arsonist. All fit the profile of those likely to be murdered by Kira. I propose that we alter the information as it appears in print, changing the pictures of 2, the names of 2, and the names and pictures of the remaining 2. We will then monitor these individuals over the next several days to see if Kira is still able to kill them. Does this sound like an acceptable plan? Yay or nay?
There was some discussion amongst the assembled ponies. A few raised hooves and waved for attention. Luna singled one out and racked her brain for a name. "Lemonhearts, do you have something to say?" The young unicorn gasped in pleasure at being recognized. The sight made Luna smile. Was this how Celestia felt all the time?
"Mr. L," the yellow filly said loudly, "if we know that Kira needs information about his victims to kill, why don't we simply shut down all the media? If we stop reporting criminals in the news, Kira won't know about them, and won't be able to kill them."
A few ponies around her nodded their heads in agreement.
A bad idea.
Elle said,
From what I've learned, Kira is arrogant and has a full right sense of justice. I also think that at this point murder has become as natural to him as breathing. If we take direct steps in stopping him from killing criminals, he will simply change his targets to those who have committed more minor offenses. If we cut off the supply completely, he may resort to killing civilians until we give him what he wants. Minor changes are less likely to be noticed, and will give us a better idea of what we are dealing with.
Lemonheart sat down, looking disappointed. After she felt the court had had enough time to think, Luna called for a vote.
"All in favor of Elle's proposal."
The exact procedures of the Night Court were unclear to most ponies, having not been used in over 1,000 years. So there was a combination of raised hooves, hoof stomps, and cries of yay from across the room. Luna tried to keep track of all of them, making a mental note to review the formalities of the court once this was all over.
"And all those against?"
Thankfully, the following moments the cries of nay were much fewer, making the vote easy to tally. Luna nodded.
"Excellent. The names and faces of the 6 will be altered in time for the next edition of the paper."
Thank you, Lady Luna.
It was hard to tell, but Elle almost sounded smug.
However, since I anticipated the full support of the court in this matter, I have already made the necessary arrangements. The altered newsprints should be being printed as we speak.
Before any angry ponies could interrupt, he continued on to his second point.
My second suggestion is this. As per Captain Strawbell's recommendation, I feel that it is the time to send trained professionals into Playville. Do we have a representative from the DPI?
Stormseeker, sir, representing the Equestrian Bureau of Investigations. He snapped a quick salute. It's an honor, sir.
Never mind that. Slide 4.
A long list of names appeared on the wall.
Behind me are the names of those players in Playville, who I believe may be or may be working with Kira. I would like as many agents as you can spare to follow one of them at a time and report any unusual or suspicious activity.
All of them, sir? The Pegasus asked incredulously.
Yes, all of them. In whatever order you choose, until such a time as Kira is captured or the investigation is closed.
Very well, sir. Stormseeker gave a final salute and started back towards his seat. Luna looked closely at the list of names. Some of them she recognized. Elle, half of the elements of harmony are on this list, she hissed.
That is true. I know what you would say. But my decision is final. I cannot afford to leave any stone unturned.
I guess. She traced her way down the list, growing increasingly worried with each name. There was no indication of how much or how little Elle suspected each one. Despite the enormous diversity of character, each one was written in the same way on the page. But how could any pony suspect the fun-loving Pinkie Pie of murder? Was the dutiful mare more of a threat than the delinquent she presided over? How would the shy, sensitive Fluttershy react if she discovered she was being watched? "Elle, I hope you know what you're doing," Luna muttered. Her eyes landed on the name of her sister's beloved student. "Oh, Tia's going to have a fit if she finds out about this." By that morning, Spike still had not returned to the library. Twilight Sparkle forced herself not to worry, and set about preparing breakfast. "I'm sure he's just out with Colgate," she muttered as she walked around the kitchen, only partly talking to herself. "She just wants him nearby in case they get another letter in a hurry. Nothing to worry about, nothing at all."
So why are you worrying?
Buke sat on the counter, munching on some dried apples he'd found in the cupboard. "I'm not worrying," Twilight insisted, a worried expression crossing over her face. I don't like it when he's away for this long. I like knowing where he is." Buke considered this.
Are you worried about it because you see him as family? Or because you're worried he's out making plans with Elle?
"Because—" Twilight paused and found that she actually had to think about her answer. "Maybe a little of both? I just don't want anything bad to happen to him, that's all." There was a loud knock at the door. Twilight rushed over, breakfast forgotten, and flung open the door to reveal Ditsy Doo. "Oh, hi, Ditsy," she said, her spirits dropping. "What's up?"
"I brought you a letter."
The Pegasus seemed unnaturally happy as she dug through her saddlebags to produce a tiny scroll of parchment. It had to be a crime to enjoy one's work that much.
"And here's your newspaper."
Twilight accepted both offerings and thanked the mailman quickly before slamming the door shut and returning to the kitchen. She tore open the little scroll and found Spike's inelegant scrawl inside. "Dear Twilight, Colgate says that I should stay nearby in case another letter arrives, so I'm going to be staying here for a night. I should be back sometime in the morning, so please don't worry about me. Love, Spike." Twilight smiled and shook her head. Typical Spike. No sense of how regular mail worked. He'd probably thought it would arrive in a matter of seconds. She folded the letter up, but put it aside, levitating the bundle of newspapers Ditsy Doo had brought towards her. Ostensibly these were to go into the library's archives, but she'd ended up finding a very different use for them. From her saddlebags by the door, she pulled out a thin, white notebook, sat down, and from the top of the pile opened up the latest edition of the Equestria Daily. Buke floated over, looking confused.
Hey, that's not the Death Note.
"That's right, it's not. How did you think I've been keeping up with my work without any pony getting suspicious?" She stopped skimming through the paper momentarily to hold up the imposter notebook. "I call this the Life Note. Some of the pages are taken from the Death Note, but only I know which ones. Whenever something related to Kira happens, I write it down in here. If any pony asks, I can tell them I'm studying Kira because I'm interested in the magic he uses. This way, I can write down the names of criminals in public, and no one will think it looks suspicious."
Sounds risky.
"I thought you liked risk." An article caught Twilight's eye. An arsonist, identified by locals as the Pegasus Bright Spark, had burned down several half-finished houses at the edge of Philadelphia. With the winter coming and reconstructions after the last great parasite infestation still incomplete, these losses would cost the city a great deal of time and money, and leave several families without homes for another year. The police had provided a picture from a recent mugshot, and were urging any pony with information regarding Bright Spark's whereabouts to come forth. "I can do better than that," Twilight thought. She picked up a quill and scratched a new name in the lap note. "By the way, there's something I've been meaning to ask you. How does the Death Note work?"
How does it work?
Buke frowned and appeared to mull over the question.
Magic?
"I thought so too, but it's not in any kind of magic I can detect. Is it some kind of special Shinigami magic?" When Buke didn't respond, Twilight lowered her newspaper to look at him. The God of Death was scratching his head, thinking furiously. Her eyes narrowed.
You don't know, do you?
Buick smiled weakly.
I never thought to ask.
This was too much. Twilight rose up and stamped at the ground angrily, bright fires burning behind her eyes. You don't know? How can you not know? You've spent your whole life carrying it around and writing in it to keep you alive, and you still don't know how it works? How can you live like that?
It didn't seem important.
Before the surprised god's eyes, the lavender unicorn underwent a remarkable transformation. The flames in her eyes seemed to expand, leaving the pony's irises completely red, and draining the color from the rest of her body. Anger crackled through her, and her mane and tail burst into flame, igniting the very air around her. Even though he knew it couldn't hurt him, Buick found himself backing away from the display. All at once, the flame went out, and the spent and singed Twilight crumpled to the floor. "Isn't there any pony who knows?" she asked wearily.
The Shinigami King might know.
"Could we ask him?" Buick looked at her as if she'd suggested they take a short walk to the moon, letting out a small chuckle.
I don't think he'd like that. There's a reason he doesn't get visitors.
Utterly defeated, Twilight picked herself up and returned to her newspaper. About 10 minutes later, the library door creaked open, and an exhausted-looking Spike trudged in. "Morning, Twilight," he said, stifling a yawn. Twilight looked up. "Good morning, Spike." She put the papers aside and trotted towards the little dragon. "I got your letter. Were you up all night?" "Yeah, most of it." Spike slumped against the wall. "I tried to go to bed, but Colgate kept talking about plans. She's really excited about Kira being in Ponyville. You know, I don't think she ever sleeps." "That's a shame. Anything you're allowed to tell me?" "I didn't know, Twilight. I didn't understand a lot of it. Sleep." He started towards the stairs. "Hey, Spike, before you do, could you send a letter for me?" "Another one?" He sighed, then considered it. "Only for you, Twilight. Or Rarity, if she asked, but no one else." Twilight smiled. "Thanks, Spike. I'll carry you." She lifted Spike onto her back and brought him to her room, where he puffed away the letter she'd written to the princess the night before. Then they went up to his room, and Twilight tucked him into bed, making sure she'd left the window open. "Sleep well, my little police officer." She smiled. Spike bumbled softly, a puff of smoke leaving his nose. After a moment's hesitation, she kissed him on the forehead and went outside. There was silence in the little room for a minute, but Twilight listened with her ear to the door. Spike yawned loudly and stretched. There was a tiny scrape and a rustling of paper, then yet another yawn as the baby dragon returned to his basket. Twilight waited for a full 5 minutes, counting the timing of his snores, before she was satisfied that her little assistant was now fully asleep. She silently opened the door and looked inside, holding her breath. The box behind Spike's basket had been disturbed. She considered her options. She could keep waiting until Spike woke up and then went out again, but that would waste precious time. She would just have to risk it, and hope the little dragon was in one of his deeper sleeps. Keeping her breath shallow, Twilight took another step forward, then another. Every time her hoof touched the ground, she cringed, expecting Spike's eyes to flutter open. She trod more lightly with each step. In less than a minute, she had made her way halfway across the tiny room.
Are you being sneaky?
Twilight yelped, overbalanced, and crashed face first to the floor. She threw up her hooves and tried to think of an excuse for Spike, but no questions or accusations came. Nervously, she opened one eye. The little dragon was still asleep, snoring out puffs of smoke. Gently, Twilight picked herself up and turned to face Buick. "Don't do that!" she hissed.
"Sorry,"
the god said in a tone suggesting he was anything but. At a more sensible pace, Twilight walked the rest of the way across the room and lifted the lid off Spike's box. As she'd expected, there was a new scroll atop the disorganized pile he'd built. She pulled away the string and unrolled it. "Dear Princess Luna, today's newspapers have arrived at the usual time. The plan is on schedule. The names and pictures of the mentioned criminals are confirmed to have been altered, awaiting further instructions. Your loyal servant, Romana. What? Twilight gasped angrily. She looked nervously at Spike, but he was still fast asleep. They were changing the names in the newspapers? Was that legal? Doing a good job of containing her panic, Twilight tied up the scroll again and put it back where she'd found it, replacing the lid onto the box. She started to make her way out of the room when Spike grunted. Twilight froze. He sniffed, snorted, then...
Ah!
A jet of green flame leapt from the bed, a scroll materializing within it. Mercifully, even through this, Spike hadn't woken. Twilight released the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and picked up the new scroll, taking it downstairs before opening it. Dear Twilight Sparkle, my most faithful student, thank you so much for your concern. I am fine. I have seen many terrible things in my lifetime, and I have survived them all. This will be no different. After learning that Kira is in Ponyville, I had intended to bring you back to Canterlot immediately. However, I was very moved by your letter to me. While I cannot permit you to participate in the investigation, it was wrong of me to think of asking you to abandon your friends so simply. I will allow you to stay in Ponyville to support those you care about. But Twilight, please promise me that you will stay out of trouble and not try to find Kira. Much as it may hurt, I don't know if I could forgive myself if anything were to happen to you. Your loving teacher, Princess Celestia. Twilight sighed. She'd dodged an arrow on this one. If she'd been moved to Canterlot, writing names in the Death Note would have been a lot more difficult, especially if Celestia decided to keep checking in on her. Still, the mayor was being unreasonable. It wasn't fair to throw Twilight's words back in her face like that. Oh well, she thought glumly. No point in pushing the issue any further. Time to take up some more urgent matters. The lavender filly returned to the kitchen, picking up the discarded newspapers. The second letter had dulled some of her panic, but the shock of the deception stayed with her. Some of the names in here had been changed? But which papers? Which faces? Which names? How many? She couldn't tell. And she couldn't keep going. They would surely be monitoring the results, and walking into the trap would only give them the information they wanted. Where? She gasped. How do I find the right names now? Another realization struck. Wasn't there a rule in the Death Note about false names? She dropped everything and rushed upstairs, slamming the door shut and ripping the note from its secret drawer. She scanned the rules inside the front cover until she saw one that made her heart sink. The Death Note will be rendered useless if a victim's name is misspelled 4 times. Behind her, Buick flitted through the wall, having taken longer to climb the stairs. Twilight looked at him with downcast eyes. Buick, she asked, I think I may have written some names wrong in the Death Note. Will it still work?
How many? Let me see.
He snatched the notebook up from the table and flipped through it, squinting at the names. I don't know, maybe a few. The God of Death scanned the latest page.
You're still good. All these names were for different ponies, right?
Yes, I think so.
Then it's not a problem.
He handed the book back. Twilight sighed with relief. Okay, that's good to know. I guess I can't use the newspapers anymore. If they caught me once so easily, they'll surely do it again. She sat down and tapped her head, thinking hard. Maybe I'm going about this the wrong way. I can be clever in this, I know. Inspiration struck. After writing the cause of death, the details of death should be written in the next 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Maybe I need to make full use of what's available to me. Twilight reached into her desk again, the stress leaving her face. Pulling out the criminal records book, she ignored her bookmark and opened it to a different section, smile widening with every passing second. She reached for a quill. Appaloosa was no longer the tiny town it had once been. Evidently not satisfied with putting up a small township and an apple orchard in less than a year, the settler ponies had simply kept building, throwing up more and more buildings and planting tree after tree. The buffalo who roamed the nearby plains were at first livid over the change, but as each bumper crop of apples was more bountiful than the last, the two groups were able to come to a more reasonable arrangement. There were even a few buffalo living in town now, and some ponies had run off to stampede with their spiritual cousins across the desert. But as the Appaloosans were slowly discovering, not all the effects of great expansion were good. For all their efforts, Appaloosa was still very much a part of the Wild West, and cut off from the rest of Equestria. The threat of total lawlessness loomed over their heads. Bar brawls were commonplace, ponies drunk on salt and fermented apples tearing the local watering holes apart, and it was a rare day when high noon didn't bring dueling stallions to the streets. Keeping control of such a place was a difficult, demanding job with little pay, but there was one pony who could always be depended on to keep the streets safe. Whenever an argument or fight broke out, he was there in an instant to smooth things over. Whenever a situation got out of hand, he would put a stop to it just by walking in the door. And if there was ever a criminal or dastardly mastermind on the loose, you could bet your last bit that Sheriff Silverstar would be the one to catch them. Most of the time, anyway. Presently the sheriff was taking a nap. Sheriff Silverstar laid back in his office, catching up on his favorite pastime. The office was new, as was most of the building, and he was growing to like it. At last year's council meeting, it had been decided that the tiny offices he'd been operating out of were now laughably small for a town this size. He had a proper police station of his very own, complete with his own room, his own desk, and his own extremely comfortable chair. Sure, sometimes he missed laying back on the front porch and watching life go by, but he had an eager assistant to do that for him now. And with all the day's paperwork filled out, and all 19 cells of their tiny jail filled, there was simply nothing else for him to do. The town's clock chimed the hour. At the same time, panicked shouts rang out from the station's cells. Silverstar grumbled and considered covering his ears and rolling over. But they did sound serious. He supposed it was his duty to check it out. Brushing a few crumbs out of his mustache, he rolled out of his chair and made his way to the back room. What he saw surprised him. The old drunk, Salty, was lying unmoving in his bunk, lifeless. This was saddening, but not terribly shocking. The old pony hadn't been a day sober in 20 years. What was surprising was the reactions of those in the other cells, troublemaker and murderer alike, including some of the roughest, toughest stallions known to ponydom. All were trembling and cowering in the corner of their cells, as far from the pony as they could get. "He's dead!" stammered Angel Eyes in the opposite cell, a villainous pony Silverstar had never known to show fear, even in the face of the royal guard. "He yelled, and then he just fell over. It's magic, I tells you! Magic!" Before the sheriff could say anything, the other inmates began shouting as well. "I saw him! 'Tain't natural! He's gonna get us too! Kira's gonna get us!" "Whoa, whoa!" Silverstar held up 2 hooves, silencing the panicked prisoners. "He was sold his time, boys, nothing more. You're spending too much time listening to Carl's tall tales if you believe otherwise."
What they say is true,
boomed a loud voice from the far end of the room.
This is the work of Kira.
Sheriff Silverstar walked down to the end of the row of cells. The final one was 3 times the size of the others, built to house buffalo instead of ponies. This was one of the agreements he had made with Chief Thunderhooves. If a crime was committed within Appaloosa, it would be dealt with by Appaloosans. Accordingly, when a lone buffalo had been found selling faulty dream catchers and fake deer skulls to young ponies on the edge of town, an extension to the station had been built just for him. "You got something to say, Nature's Call?" The self-proclaimed shaman drew himself up proudly.
I have heard the winds whisper across the plains, and all speak the name of Kira. The sky weeps for those he kills, and the earth trembles at his touch. A god of death now walks this land, and his wrath will be great and terrible.
"Is that so?" Silverstar wrinkled his mustache. "I'll be sure to remember that. I'll also ask you to not start causing a panic, unless you feel like staying here an extra month."
Heed my words, so-called Silver Star,
the buffalo yelled as the sheriff walked away.
Death has found this place. Death shall follow you.
It took little time to deal with Salty's passing. The old pony had no living relatives or next of kin, nor any real possessions to speak of. So for once, all the paperwork was done in a snap. No clear cause of death, but that was often the case with old drunks. Once the cell was cleaned up and the body sent away to the morgue, Sheriff Silverstar felt it was safe to return to his nap. He had scarcely sat down, however, when the bell tolled again, and screams rang out from the back a second time. He ran down with more urgency this time, only to stop dead in his tracks. His mouth dropped open. There, in the corner, lay his old friend and nemesis, Angel Eyes, the once proud face now frozen in a mask of absolute fear. When the bell tower chimed a third time, screams rang out once more. Silverstar didn't bother to check the cells. Instead he went out to the front of the building, where his apprentice was intently surveying the main square, watching for signs of danger. "Howdy, Junior." The little colt jumped in surprise, almost knocking his oversized hat off. The sheriff chuckled. "Tell me, you still have those outstanding arrest warrants handy?"
"Absolutely, sir."
Hooves Jr. reached into a bag and presented several well-worn leaves of paper.
"Are we going out, sir?"
The older pony smiled. He couldn't put his hoof on why, but having the foal around had always brightened his day. The boy was young and overly pacifistic, but he was quick to learn and eager to lend a helping hoof. "Yup. It seems some character called Kira's been cleaning out some cells for us. It'd be a shame not to fill them." Silverstar leaned forward to examine the first page he'd been presented with. "Butch Castle and Sundancer Kid? With names like those, we can expect him to have 'em back by tonight. Settle up, boy, we're going hunting." And so, not 20 minutes later, an aging sheriff and a tiny colt who wanted to be a doctor galloped out of Appaloosa. No plan, no backup, no weapons but a single apple pie. But that was Silverstar's way. He had 2 names to follow, and a friend by his side, and most importantly, he had his badge of authority. He had justice. No, better than that. He was justice. Again and again, the clock tower tolled the hour.
Dear Princess Luna, yesterday I had close to 50 dedicated ponies on my investigative team. Now we number less than 20. I believe that seeing a pony die on crystal vision has hurt morale greatly. A friend told me this morning that she doesn't know who to fear more now, Kira or Elle. Arguments are becoming more frequent, and I'm worried that soon the team will break down completely. I'm afraid that part of what's causing this discord is a lack of direction. I do my best to be a strong leader, but it's hard to tell ponies what to do without a clear directive in mind. Please, Princess, for their sake, let us have something to do. None of these ponies are trained to deal with the stress of simply watching and waiting. Give us a task, just a small one, if only to keep us occupied. It chills my blood to think of Kira finding victory by watching us tear each other apart. Your faithful servant, Romana.
And that, fillies and gentle colts, was Chapter 4. I guess most importantly in that chapter, did you like my new Derpy Hooves voice? I'm not sure about it. I think it sounds a bit masculine, but it sounds more derpy, so have your pick. I really wish I had more time to work on the accents for each part, but I really don't get much time to record, so it's mostly just live reading. I just do it once, and unless there's a major problem, I don't go back again.